Dan, it's good to see you again.
It's great to be with you, Jacob.
Today is January 9th, a momentous date in American history, not simply because Elvis Presley was born today, not simply because I was born today.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. But also Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9th. I want to ask you about the Nixon legacy, particularly in foreign policy. Is Trump a Nixonian, and does Nixon's legacy in foreign policy look better than ever?
Absolutely. So I am a fan of Richard Nixon's, and maybe that's a minority view, but I suspect I'm a first mover. And I think over the next 25 years, as my kids grow up and I have grandkids, they're going to look back and say Richard Nixon will be appraised in a far better way than I think the boomers or the silent generation did, because I think they were the folks who were boomers and silent generation types were around for Nixon and often were emotionally invested in the fights. There were fights over the pumpkin papers and was Alger Hiss a spy?
Now, I want to ask you about that.
Yes.
Sam Tannenhouse wrote the definitive biography of Whittaker Chambers, and he showed that Chambers was absolutely right about Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss had served in the State Department, had been at Yalta, was in the Roosevelt administration, and turned out to be, Whittaker Chambers was reporting to Hiss in Washington, D.C. Now,
as a spy when he was a spy, and then he quit being a spy and quit being a communist.
Right. But he went into hiding because he was afraid that what was then the NKVD,
they'd kill him.
Stalin's secret police.
I mean, look what they did to Trotsky.
Right.
This wasn't the Vienna Boys Choir, Jacob.
Right.
Right. So
well, do you know what Hiss said to Chambers when Chambers said to him, "It's time. You need to get out of this." And Hiss said, "Stalin plays for keeps." He thought he was on the winning side, and that Stalin would win. So Nixon was vilified by the American left, remains vilified for having exposed Alger Hiss.
So I'm always grateful to Hugh Hewitt, the phenomenal radio host, when he does a first interview with a new guest, asks two questions. Have you read The Looming Tower, which is about terrorism since 9/11? And the second was Alger Hiss, a Soviet spy? And 90% of the time, he gets the correct answer, which is yes. But once in a while, and it's a tell, when you have someone who's a committed leftist, he'll say, well, and mealy-mouthed and whatever. Now, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Jacob, there was this window of 5 years where the Soviet files were open to historians and researchers. And there were a number of revisions of histories. There was revisions of the Spanish Civil War. There were revisions on the Cold War and on espionage because of this. Then, of course, we have the Mitrokhin archive that came in 1999. All these things say that Alger Hiss was absolutely a Soviet spy. There were absolutely Soviet sympathizers and Soviet spies in the American government. The person who led America's negotiations for the Bretton Woods institutions,
Harry Dexter White.
Harry Dexter White was a straight-up Soviet spy.
Now, the interesting thing about Hiss...
And no one says jack about this. And if you say to the IMF, you were born in sin because your formation was created by this straight-up Soviet spy, they won't cop to it, they won't admit to it, but it's the God's honest truth.
Now, the one thing I will say about Hiss is he was not the most significant spy. He became significant because he was an unrepentant liar and because he sued Chambers for libel.
He was also beautiful people, Jacob. He had all the right pedigrees.
Now, he and Nixon actually tangled personally.
Right, so people didn't like Nixon. So all the right people hated Nixon. Nixon didn't come from money. He didn't go to the right college. He was a self-made guy. And so a lot of people in Washington who were part of the foreign policy establishment, of which I guess you could say I'm a part of now, didn't like Richard Nixon. Well, Richard Nixon was right.
Well, Richard Nixon went to Whittier College.
And anti-communism was sort of seen as kind of middle brow, and also because some of the allies of anti-communism, like Joseph McCarthy, were people didn't like him. And so as a result, well, he became anti-communism, right? These things that you and I remember and know about, Jacob.
However, the interesting thing about Nixon is, as a foreign policy president, he did prove quite supple, didn't he? I mean, he reached out to both China and to Moscow, pursuing détente with Russia and Henry Kissinger
Yes.
as his Secretary of State,
Yes.
while trying to play the China card at the same time.
So I think Richard Nixon was a brilliant, in many ways, brilliant foreign policy president. He supported Israel in Israel's moment of need. There's this famous moment where he says, send everything that flies. I think it was to support Golda Meir. People don't remember that, but I remember that. And so we owe Nixon a great debt for supporting Israel in its moment of need. He was a very astute, he had gone as a freshman member of Congress to Italy in the run-up to the Marshall Plan.
Together with JFK, I think.
I think so. So they were told not to bring tuxedos or evening wear because it was not to be seen as a junket. So this was to prepare the country for NATO and to prepare the country for the Marshall Plan. So he, early on as a congressman, was exposed to the world and realized that this was going to be a different ballgame, and he was prepared to do that. Look, I think the approach to, if I had been in the Nixon White House, would I have recommended a rapprochement with China? Yes, I would have, because at the time the thinking was we're going to split the Soviet-China relationship. There were frictions at the time. So it was seen as an incredible move to split the China-Soviet relationship. Did it go on for too long? Yes. Were we too enamored with the policy? And maybe, we should have probably had changed it or adjusted it 20 years earlier before, say, 2015, probably. But for 20 or 25 years, it was the right policy to pursue. And so he did the right thing, and he did the right thing in Israel. He did the right thing in supporting Israel. He did the right thing then. He also had a very astute understanding of the Russians and the Soviet mindset. Very astute. There's videos of him online talking about the Russians and of the Chinese later in life. He's wrote a series of important books after his presidency. I think the folks who love to hate him in the mainstream media have all passed on, thankfully. Most of the folks, the boomers and the silent generation who were invested in animus towards him, have all left the stage, thankfully. And I think we can have a little bit more of a cooler head assessment of Nixon. I'm a fan of Richard Nixon's, and I have been for many decades. But I would also say, if you look at Nadia Shadlow did some really interesting research work. She's at the Hudson Institute now. She was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. She's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Looked at President Nixon and then looked at President Trump's foreign policy and said, much of President Trump's approach to the world mirrors or rhymes with President Nixon's approach to the world. So as opposed to comparing President Trump
you see Trump as a realist at bottom.
He's he's a realist at bottom, yes. In many ways, he's a realist. You're not going to you didn't hear President Nixon talk that much about, say, democracy. And it's not empty. It's not zero. There is some discussion about it in places like Iran or elsewhere, or Cuba. But or protection of Christians. So democracy and human rights, protecting Christians is of course a human right issue, or fighting anti-Semitism is a human rights issue. These are important issues, and the Trump administration, to their great credit, has reemphasized these issues, and I'm very supportive of that. But I think he would say we have our interests, and sometimes we're going to have to work with difficult regimes that we don't want to, that doesn't necessarily follow sort of our follow the exact way that we might do things. But we have to, because these are the partners we have at the moment, and we need to work with them.
So Trump is a new Nixon.
Trump is the new Nixon.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Jacob.